The title of my talk today is If at First You Don't Succeed. I think most people can finish this often quoted line. So when I was in primary school, one of our teachers had two quotations over the blackboard. The first one was, do what you do well. And the second was, if at first you don't succeed, try again. And it was a picture of Dennis Taylor, who had won the 1985 World Snooker Championships. What's interesting about these two quotes is that they've served me well over the years. But more recently, I've come to enjoy a new interpretation of if at first you don't succeed, try again. It's the one by David Brent from The Office. If at first you don't succeed, hide all evidence you ever tried in the first place. So if it doesn't work out today, okay, I'm snookered. The notion of trying and failing and continuing is a really interesting one, and it's kind of the theme of my talk here today. But to introduce myself properly, my name is Dr. Paul McCarthy, and I'm saying that with emphasis, not because I've earned that PhD, but more for the notion that I carry a level of competence, or at least I'm supposed to have, when I work with people, and I work a lot in sport. And this notion of working in sport is really important because the people who are seeing a psychologist often feel that there is some stigma attached to it. If you're working with a psychologist, you must have problems. But once you come to see a psychologist, we do a very clever thing. We turn your problems into issues. No more problems. But that notion that psychologists are working with problems and dealing with issues is a really narrow view. And we're really looking at enlightened self-interest. How do I get the best out of myself in every possible way? And getting the best out of ourselves often means that we are trying to understand where we are now and where we want to go to in the future. That process of enlightened self-interest is really about seeing the whole picture. And there's a lovely quote, ever tried, ever failed, no matter. Try again, fail better. It's a quote by Samuel Beckett. But the notion of that trying and failing doesn't work well for everybody. So when we work with athletes, we're looking at different components, physical, mental, technical, tactical, and lifestyle. We're trying to present an entire view of the athlete's life. And why? The psychologist has a unique role because he or she is usually stepping a little bit further away than the coach, strength and conditioning coach, nutritionist, and so on. They're there as a sounding board, and they're there to give a perspective that most athletes might not ordinarily get from the team around them. And in sport, just as in life, we have a lot of compare and despair. You look at yourself, you see somebody else, and you come up short. And we do this all the time. What we wear, what we achieve, the car we drive, the holidays we go on. So what we tend to do is poison the present with this compare and despair. We're sad about what happened in the past, worried about what might happen in the future, and the present doesn't get any better. So most of the work of a psychologist, and especially in sport, is trying to look at psychological fitness. How do we manage ourselves better, seeing the challenges that we experience every day? And this notion, and the thread of today's talk, is about that resilience that we have, a notion of motivation. Now, I'm going to do a disservice to all the motivational theorists out here by the next analogy I'm going to use about motivation. But if we conceptualize motivation as energy and direction, I'll explain it like this. Imagine you are a car in a car park filled with petrol, but you keep going around the car park. You have lots of energy, but no direction. Alternatively, you could be a car on the motorway, knowing where you're going, but no petrol and no energy to drive you where you're going. So that notion of energy and direction is interesting because sometimes we're without energy, sometimes we're without direction. Sometimes we're without both. And many people seek the help of a psychologist to be able to deal with these issues. But the psychologist can only work with these issues if the person coming to see us is willing to work on these things, him or herself. So we need the client to be engaged. And that's the really hard part. Because most people who come to see us would like us to take away all the issues that seem to surround them. And then we tell them we can't until they start to help themselves. But this notion of motivation then, when we think about it, how you might have been motivated in the past, especially if you've been involved in sport, much of it is shouting, screaming, swearing, demeaning, running you down, running other people down. And we've all had a lot of that. Does it make you feel good? Doesn't seem to. But somehow we think this must be the way forward. Threaten people, put them under pressure. So what we often tend to do is we end up attacking somebody's personality, their attributes and their character. So we are attacking them personally. And the interesting thing about it is that it doesn't tend to work so well because words are knives. So here's my prop. I'm not going to hurt anybody here today, but just to illustrate what I mean. If I say words are knives, I said this to my little boy and he said, yeah, Dad, of course they are. Words hurt. Words hurt. If I use this knife in my interactions with other people, I could hand them, as we are safely asked to do, the handle, or I could hand them the blade. Now, we all know the right thing to do. But our interactions with others often mean that we are handing them the blade, and our interactions with ourselves, we're often handing ourselves the blade. We're hurtful to others, hurtful to ourselves. Some people think this works, and I guess a little bit of it does. But we're trying to move away from that notion towards a more enlightened view, that we have alternatives. We could listen to somebody to motivate them. We could ask them what they enjoy. We could ask them what it is they need and how they need it and the way in which they need it. We could provide a supportive environment. Now, that's lovely for me to stand up here and say this, but in the world of professional sport or in education or in business, it doesn't go down so well because it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of endeavour. And that notion of hard work seems like too much. It's much easier to shout at somebody or scream. But the difficulty with that is that the emotional balm we're all looking for, we rarely get. Now, we might be able to get it in other ways through maybe tranquilizing our emotions through maybe alcohol or food or whatever we can. But we never really get to the root of what's going on. And recently, a golf coach asked me, well, I suppose a few years ago now, asked me if I would see one of his players. And he said he's a great guy, but he's so negative. In fact, he's so negative, the coach said, that he loses mobile phone reception when he's working with him. This is interesting. So he said, I'd like you to see what you could do. So when I met him, things weren't going so well. And he said that he had made so little on tour this year that money thought he was dead. And he was really looking for a helping hand here. So I said, well, let's see where we can go. When we started talking, it became clear that his interpretation of the world, his way of making sense of it, was that he was a victim. Fair enough. But more than that, the way he treated himself was a bit like that knife. The blade went in a lot. So what he did to the ball, he thought was the coach's domain. But what the ball did to him was my domain. How was I going to help him feel better about what was going on and off the golf course? But after speaking for a little while, we said the best way to begin here is a little bit of self-awareness, getting to know yourself. And because he was going back out on tour, I just suggested he might read a book for a little bit of enlightenment, which he did. And the notion within this book is trying to help us to see ourselves. And nobody really wants to see ourselves, because if anyone has read M. Scott Peck's book, The Road Less Travelled, you might understand. The very first line of this book says, life is difficult. And it's a line all on its own, a sentence all on its own. And what it goes on to say is that if you accept that life is difficult, life becomes easy, because you never expect anything to be easy, because you already accepted that life was difficult, nice and easy. So we're trying to hold this notion in mind that if we accept that golf is difficult or sport is difficult, we have very little to complain about, and that's wonderful for me. Within this book, Scott Peck spoke about this dilemma that he had. He was working really hard, working late, and his colleagues were leaving early, even though they had the same caseload. But he was working because he was working longer, because he was putting in a little bit more effort into the process. So he went to see his line manager. His line manager said to him, "You have a problem with your time." And he goes, "I know I have. I just told you. I'm having to work much later. Can you alter my load for me?" So he just left him. He approached him again and asked him, "You know, I told you about the problem I was having. Can you do something about it?" To which the reply came, "You have a problem with your time." Now, Scott Peck left very angry with this, and he was angry for about 3 months until he realized the lesson that his line manager was trying to teach him. He was trying to tell them that the way you live your life, the way you set your standards, they become the cause of your disappointment and anger later. He chose to put in all the effort, extra effort, more than his colleagues. Yet he was angry at somebody else, not himself. It's a strange situation, but one which, when we look at our own lives, we realize that we have a sense of responsibility and accountability to be able to look after ourselves in the right way. And once we have that sense of accountability and responsibility, we start to drive our motivation in a direction in which we are willing to travel. Now, if I said to you, "Can you write a book?" what might you say? I often ask my students and they say, "No." And then I tell them about the diving bell and the butterfly, a story about Jean-Dominique Bauby, who had locked-in syndrome and only had the use of his left eyelid. And he wrote a book. I read it. It's a lovely book. Now, if I provided that perspective, you might say to yourself, well, if he was able to write a book with his left eyelid, how did he do it? Well, there's a specific way of doing that where the most frequently used letters in the alphabet are presented first and you get somebody to help you. And obviously that's how the book, but it's a lot of blinking to say, yes, that's the letter I'm looking for. It was a difficult process. The difficult process meant a lot of time, but the principle behind it was that somebody could do something that ordinarily you might think was not possible. Not just because they're spending time, but because they're investing in a process with values they believe in. So being motivated really is following the values you hold for yourself. I like books, I like to read, but this is a lovely one that you might read maybe sometime in the future. And it's about a seagull called Jonathan Livingston Seagull. But he was no ordinary seagull. He wanted to find out how fast he could fly, how low he could fly. But he wasn't like other seagulls who just looked for food and flew out after trawlers and then back to the shore. He wanted to become faster and faster and faster. And as you'll read in the book, the story shows him getting very, very good at something nobody else thought he could do. But the flock didn't like that he was really good at this. They wanted him to be just like them, but he wanted to be different. He was motivated to change, to maximize his potential. And it saw him being excluded from the flock. He went away and came back, but he wasn't allowed to join the flock. But others within the flock thought, I'd like to be able to do what he's doing. So they went to seek his help, and they tried to learn from him. And after a while, they thought that everything he possessed was something extraordinary, nothing that the seagulls themselves could have. But what he was trying to explain to them was he got better at flying simply by investing time and effort and learning. And fundamentally, that's all we're ever trying to do. We get better at what we do by investing time. So we could solve most problems we have through effort, strategy, and help from others. If you think about that, that's pretty good. There's a little bit more to it than that, but that's pretty helpful. Effort, strategy, and help from others. You can always put in effort, you can always change your strategy, and you can always get help from others. Lots of people come to see me and they say, I've tried everything. And I say, everything? Okay, maybe not everything. 10 things. Really? 10? Okay, maybe not 10. 2 things, and both of them don't work. And usually that notion that they've tried everything isn't true. And even the effort they put in mightn't be true either. So as psychologists, we're trying to help people to value themselves first, to make the change possible, and then figure out what's the right strategy, working with the client towards their ends. Now, when we look at ourselves, we see ourselves as we were born and as we grew up. There was, our early childhood was the authentic self. We just went around as we did. Our youngest is 2, and she will happily run around with no nappy on. Happy, happy, happy. And when she's sad, she cries, and when she's angry, she throws things. But as she gets older, that authentic self changes a little bit, because people tell her that you can't do that, and you need to do things that are the right things. So she becomes an adapted child, and she learns to do things that Mummy and Daddy think are the right things to do. And after a while, she realizes that as I am, I'm unacceptable. But if I do the right things, I become acceptable. And that works for us for most of our lives. But at this stage of our lives, we often think about, what would I be like if I had the best parts of myself? So if I was going to change my diet, go to the gym, eat fruit for breakfast, drink water all day, get up in the morning early, hit the gym, all of these things that we promise ourselves, and reluctantly can't follow through. A bit like the New Year's resolution. We want something, but somehow either the effort or the strategy goes awry. And part of the reason why the effort or strategy goes awry is because we're looking for something, but in the wrong place. If I said, just like we had spoken with the golfer, that we were going to look for something that we are choosing, not what somebody else wants, but something of our own choosing, we would be much closer to finding what we are looking for. So when somebody comes to see a psychologist, we're firstly working on their awareness, getting to know themselves. And all they want really is the opportunity to get to know themselves. They're scared by it, but they, in the end, value the opportunity. And there's a lovely quote by T.S. Eliot that says, "Footfalls echo in the memory, down the passage we did not take, towards the door we never opened." And it is about regrets. Of all regrets of tongue and pen, the saddest are these, what might have been. And that quote helps us to see a world of future. A future, if we travel down a particular road, we don't know what other roads are going to be like, but we're going down there in an enlightened way. We've taken a look at ourselves, we said change is possible, and we're seeking to go forward. So before I go, this notion of psychological fitness is available for everybody. Change is difficult but possible, and we can always step lightly into the future for everything we need. Thank you very much.